Hey guys, tonight we drift to the rocky edge of Sicily, where the sea brushes up against a coast lined with old villas, salt-worn docks, and winding streets that know more than they'll ever confess. The year is 1982, and the Palermo coast wears a fragile calm like a thin coat of paint, elegant from afar, but cracking if you lean in too close. The breeze carries the scent of citrus and gasoline, and somewhere beneath it all, the faintest trace of gun oil. You probably won't survive this world, not without learning how to smile politely while counting the exits in the room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun lifts slow over the Tyrrhenian Sea, spilling pale gold across the rooftops of Mondello, the sleepy beach suburb that wakes only when it must. Fishing boats, still damp with night spray, rock in the harbor, their nets hanging like tired arms over the water. Men in worn caps speak in short phrases, too clipped to be friendly chatter, eyes darting toward the shore where the first cars hum into the day. Palermo's coast looks timeless here, but beneath its postcard beauty lies a labyrinth of unspoken arrangements. Every crate unloaded, every handshake in the fish market, is part of a story no newspaper prints. Rosario Riccobono steps out from his villa, tailored jacket resting perfectly despite the coastal breeze. To most neighbors, he's simply the gentleman, a man who tips well at the cafe, attends weddings with quiet grace, and knows the right blessing for every occasion. But the fishermen, the dock hands, and the men who work the night shift at the warehouse, they see the subtler signs. The way people part for him without a word, the faint nods exchanged with drivers who never quite make eye contact. He walks toward the marina, hands in pockets, glancing at the gulls that circle overhead. Every detail is registered, every sound weighed. Somewhere, a Vespa backfires, and his gaze lingers for half a second longer than casual. Palermo in 1982 is not a city you stroll through without knowing where your feet will land. The murders of judges and politicians in the past decade have left the air heavy with unspoken dread. Yet here, along the coast, Riccobono maintains a different order, one not written in any statute, but just as binding. At the cafe near the pier, the same table is waiting. The owner brings espresso without asking. They speak of weather, fishing conditions, and the tourist season. But each sentence has its shadow. When a mention of the new boat from Trapani slips into the conversation, no one laughs. It's not about boats. Not really. Historical fact slips into the scene quietly. By the early 1980s, Palermo had become a focal point in the so-called Second Mafia War, a violent reshaping of Sicily's underworld that saw old alliances burn out like cheap fuses. Many people still think that the coast remained untouched in those years, spared from the worst of it. So what do you think? Can any shoreline truly stay clean when the tides are this red? Riccobono leaves the cafe, heading toward the smaller dock where a handful of men unload crates marked for restaurants. He doesn't touch them. He doesn't have to. The men know the balance. What gets passed forward? What gets tucked away in the storeroom under a stack of ice? His role is more like the tide itself, unseen in its pull, but steady enough that you notice when it's gone. By midday, the streets grow warmer, and the salt air thickens with the smell of frying sardines from an open kitchen window. Riccobono passes through the narrow alley near the old stone wall, where a boy plays soccer with a deflated ball. The ball rolls toward him, and he stops it gently with his foot. The boy freezes, not out of fear exactly, but with the instinct of someone who's learned which grown-ups matter. Riccobono returns the ball with a slow kick and a small nod. No words, just enough to be remembered. That's the Palermo coast at dawn in 1982, a blend of salt and ceremony, caution and courtesy. And for Rosario Riccobono, it's just another morning maintaining the kind of peace that never comes free. The wind shifts by late morning, curling off the sea with a touch of warmth, carrying the scent of diesel from the port and fresh bread from a bakery tucked behind the old post office. Riccobono walks with the ease of someone who knows every shortcut and hidden bend along Palermo's coast, his polished shoes tracing a path through narrow streets where the paint peels, but the dignity lingers. His youth wasn't written in privilege, but in proximity to it. Born in a cramped flat where the sound of waves was almost loud enough to drown the arguments from the neighbors, Rosario learned early that power was less about what you shouted and more about who listened when you spoke softly. His father, a dock worker with hands like ship rope, taught him to spot the small shifts, the change in the tide, the way a man's tone tightens when a lie passes through his teeth. By the time he was 16, Riccobono was already running errands for older men who liked their favors repaid in silence. One of them, an uncle by marriage, would often take him to the quieter side of the harbor where the real business happened, not in the daylight bustle of fishermen hauling their catch, but in the shadow of warehouses that smelled faintly of oil and oranges. It wasn't all crime, not in the clear-cut way outsiders imagined. Some of it was simply keeping the peace, ensuring that certain disputes never reached the ears of the carabinieri. A mainstream historical note fits snugly here. In mid-century Palermo, particularly the coastal quarters, small-time smuggling often blurred with legitimate trade. Many people still think that these were separate worlds, but they were not. Fishing boats carried both sardines and contraband, and the same handshake that confirmed a tuna sale could also guarantee a shipment's safe arrival in Naples. As a boy, Riccobono carried notes in envelopes, never looking inside, never asking questions. His reward wasn't money at first. It was trust. A man who trusts you is a man who will bring you into bigger rooms where decisions shape the next week for an entire street. By 20, he was the youngest face at those gatherings, and the older men would glance at him during heated debates, as if measuring how much of their world he understood. He understood more than they suspected. He noticed who poured the wine, who poured the grappa, and who deliberately poured nothing at all. He saw how a smile could be a warning, how a refusal could be softened into agreement if offered with the right pause, and he began to cultivate his own signature, never rushing, never raising his voice, never letting a man walk away without feeling like he had been heard. One afternoon, in his early 20s, he accompanied his uncle to a meeting in a seaside trattoria. The owner had prepared a private room overlooking the water, the curtains drawn just enough to keep the sunlight off the table. 3 men sat waiting, all older, all with the careful stillness of people who prefer to listen first. Riccobono stood behind his uncle, saying nothing, watching the way hands rested on the table. Later, as they left, his uncle asked what he had noticed. Rosario listed them: the man with the signet ring who kept glancing toward the door, the one with the cigarette who never inhaled, the one who smiled but never showed his teeth. His uncle nodded, said nothing more, but the next week, Riccobono was invited back, this time with a chair at the table. Even now, in 1982, Those early lessons guide him. He moves like a man who carries an invisible map of loyalties and debts in his mind. Passing the corner where the old barber shop stands, he stops in for a trim. The barber greets him as Signor Riccobono, a title offered without irony. They talk about the summer festival coming up, about whether the fireworks will be as grand as last year's. In between sentences, the barber glances at the mirror, catching the briefest nods from Rosario in reply to unspoken questions. As he leaves, the midday sun is higher, and the shadows retreat from the cobblestones. Riccobono steps into them anyway, taking the quieter alleys, the same ones he used as a boy when delivering notes in brown envelopes. For him, Palermo's coast isn't just home, it's a ledger he's been writing in his whole life, one quiet favor at a time. By early afternoon, the light along the Palermo coast turns sharper, bleaching the tops of buildings and throwing narrow alleys into deep, cool shade. Riccobono leaves the bustle of the port behind, stepping into the quieter streets where laundry flutters above like slow-moving flags. These are the streets that shaped him, not the grand boulevards where officials parade, but the lived-in arteries of the city, where a man's name travels faster than his footsteps. Family here is not just blood. It's the uncle who covers a debt when you're 19 and too proud to ask twice. It's the godfather who remembers your birthday without fail. And sometimes, it's the cousin you barely trust, but cannot cut loose without sending a dangerous message. For Riccobono, this web of loyalty and rivalry is both shield and snare. His mother's side is known for its careful, church-going respectability. His father's side is whispered about in the same tone people use for tides that can drag you under. In his youth, family gatherings were never just meals. They were quiet negotiations disguised as Sunday dinners. He'd watch his aunts serve pasta while listening to conversations about fishing quotas, construction permits, and whose boy was seen in the wrong neighborhood. A raised eyebrow from one man might end an argument that had been simmering for weeks. As a child, he learned not to interrupt those moments. As a young man, he learned to use them. One afternoon in the late 1960s stands out in his memory. A distant cousin, Enzo, had been caught in a dispute over a shipment that went missing between Naples and Palermo. Enzo swore it was a misunderstanding. The other party swore it was theft. At the family table, voices rose until Riccobono, barely 20, leaned in and spoke with a calm certainty that silenced the room. He proposed a compromise. Half payment now, half after the goods were returned. It was the first time the older men listened to him without looking through him. That day, he learned that in their world, a solution that leaves everyone slightly dissatisfied is often the safest one. Historically, Palermo in those years was a city caught between the remnants of old-world honor codes and the new, more ruthless methods that would define the mafia wars ahead. Many people still think that family loyalty was unshakable then, but the truth was more fragile. It bent, it strained, and in the wrong light, it snapped. Riccobono kept his close ties by never asking a family member to do something he wouldn't do himself, at least not directly. In 1982, those same blood ties are both his armor and his greatest liability. His older brother, Pietro, runs a legitimate shipping business that sometimes carries questionable cargo. His cousin, Salvatore, manages a cafe that doubles as a meeting spot for men who never drink more than one glass of wine. And his sister, Maria, married into a family from Trapani, expanding his network, but also introducing new rivalries he can't afford to ignore. On this particular day, Riccobono visits his brother's warehouse. The men there greet him warmly, offering a tour of stacked crates labeled in various languages. The air smells of citrus, coffee beans, and faintly of machine oil. While Pietro discusses a new shipment from Spain, Rosario watches a forklift operator take an unusual route across the floor, skirting a certain row of crates entirely. He says nothing, just stores it away. In his world, information is like fine wine. It's better when aged. Leaving the warehouse, he walks back toward the coast, passing a small piazza where older men play cards under the shade of a fig tree. One of them, an old friend of his father's, waves him over. They talk about nothing in particular. The weather, a new priest at the church, the price of anchovies, but every sentence is a test. Riccobono passes without effort, slipping between politeness and the unspoken reassurances that keep his position intact. As the bells from a nearby church mark the hour, he continues toward home. The air is thick now, the sea breeze carrying a hint of coming rain. Somewhere in the mix of salt and damp stone, there's also the scent of memory, of family dinners where alliances were made over pasta, and rivalries cooled just enough to last another week. For Riccobono, those bonds are never simple, never clean, but always necessary. Clouds drift in from the northwest. By the time Riccobono reaches the edge of the port district again, the lights softening across the sea. The Palermo docks in 1982 are a living thing. Timber groans under the weight of cargo, ropes creak, and gulls bicker overhead. Men in weathered jackets move with the precision of habit, unloading crates and barrels with barely a word exchanged. The casual observer might see only a fishing hub. Riccobono sees an entire system breathing in rhythm, its arteries running from the tidewater to backroom counting tables. From a distance, it looks almost picturesque. Stacks of wooden crates marked for markets in Naples and Genoa, coils of rope neatly hung, nets draped like laundry. But to those who work the docks, every piece has its place in a delicate choreography. A boat, arriving an hour too early or too late, can shift the whole day's rhythm. Riccobono has made sure that rhythm runs to his liking. He pauses near a row of small fishing vessels, their paint chipped by years of salt and sun. One of the captains, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard named Alfio, greets him with a nod. They speak briefly about the incoming tuna run, but their eyes both drift toward a pair of younger men loading a truck at the far end of the pier. No one says their names aloud. In this part of Palermo, a nod is a full sentence. Historically, the Palermo docks have been more than a marketplace. They've been a strategic prize. Control over these piers has meant influence over both legal and illicit trade for decades. Many people still think that the fishing trade was untouched by organized crime. But in reality, the docks were one of the most valuable assets in the city, a place where customs inspections could be nudged in the right direction with the right handshake. Riccobono built his influence here not by intimidation, but by quiet efficiency. He knew which foreman had a gambling problem, which sailor sent money home to his mother in Syracuse, and which inspector liked a certain French brand of cigarettes. He never demanded loyalty. He made it the natural choice. This afternoon, he heads toward the customs shed, where an official is leaning against the doorframe, lighting a cigarette. The man straightens when he sees him, offering a smile that's more formal than warm. They talk about the storm forecast for the weekend, the delay it might cause in unloading certain vessels. Between the lines, they settle something else entirely, a shift in schedule for a particular ship arriving under a false registry. No threats, no raised voices, just an understanding sealed in the brief pause before the official flicks away his match. Riccobono moves on, stopping at a small warehouse that smells of brine and engine oil. Inside, stacks of crates are being inventoried. He doesn't interrupt. He simply observes, and the workers adjust their pace without being told. A young man slips a clipboard toward him, showing a list of goods: fish, olives, textiles. 2 items have small marks beside them. He nods once, hands the clipboard back, and leaves. On his way home, he walks the long way, past the shipyard, where rusting hulls wait to be repaired. The late afternoon sun filters through gaps in the clouds, casting pale gold over the water. This is his territory, not through ownership papers or official titles, but through the kind of control that leaves no fingerprints. The port breathes because he allows it to. As he steps off the final pier, a sudden gust carries the sharp scent of tar from the shipyard and the faint sweetness of oranges from a nearby truck. It's a reminder of the dual nature of Palermo's coast: hard labor and soft luxury, muscle and manners. And in that balance, Rosario Riccobono stands like the tide itself, shaping the shore without ever seeming to move. Evening begins to unfurl over Palermo with the lazy stretch of a cat, the sun dipping lower and pulling the shadows longer across the stone streets. Along the coastal promenade, cafes fill with locals claiming their regular tables, the clink of espresso cups mingling with the hum of small talk. For most, it's the city winding down. For Riccobono, it's when another layer of business begins. He has cultivated something rare in his line of work, an image that slips easily between the worlds of respectability and power. They call him the gentleman, not out of mockery, but because the title fits. He wears it like a tailored suit, precise but never ostentatious. His suits are always pressed, shoes polished to a muted shine. Even in the heat of a Sicilian summer, he refuses to appear rumpled. Presentation, he believes, is as much a weapon as any blade. When he steps into a room, the conversation doesn't stop. It bends subtly to acknowledge him. At weddings, he dances exactly once with the bride if she is family, with the bride's mother if she is not. At funerals, he speaks little, placing his hand on the grieving shoulder and holding it just long enough for the gesture to be remembered. His way of moving through the city is deliberate, designed to disarm without appearing manipulative. One night in the mid-1970s, he attended a banquet for a visiting business delegation from the mainland. The room was full of polished silverware, crisp white tablecloths, and the muted laughter of men already calculating the next day's deals. Riccobono, seated near the middle of the long table, said almost nothing until dessert. Then, with a single remark, half compliment, half suggestion, he redirected a conversation about shipping tariffs toward a more favorable agreement for a certain Palermo company. It was done with such ease that the man sitting beside him later confessed he hadn't realized they'd been negotiating at all. A historical fact slides neatly into place here. In Sicily, especially during the late 20th century, influence often flowed not through public declarations, but through private moments, shared meals, brief encounters, the exchange of favors that left no paper trail. Many people still think that the mafia's influence was built solely on fear, but Riccobono's rise shows the other side: the cultivation of respect, the appearance of mutual benefit. His charm was never about loud gestures. He could listen to a man talk for an hour without interrupting. Then, with one sentence, leave the man believing they'd agreed on everything. He remembered names, not just of men in power, but of their wives, children, even the family dog. In a world where memory could mean the difference between loyalty and betrayal, this was currency of the highest order. That evening on the Palermo coast, as the street lamps flicker on and cast halos in the warm air, Riccobono meets an old acquaintance outside a restaurant. They shake hands, exchange pleasantries, and stroll a short distance together. The conversation is light, almost trivial, about the new chef in town, about the fishing festival next month. But beneath it runs a current of something else entirely. A mutual recognition that information has just been exchanged without a single explicit word. By the time they part, the street is quieter. Riccobono continues alone, the sound of his shoes tapping softly against the pavement. Somewhere behind him, music from a small trattoria drifts into the night, mingling with the scent of basil and salt air. For the people who pass him, he is simply a well-dressed man enjoying an evening walk. For those who know better, he is the calm center of a storm they can't yet see. The next morning begins with a brittle brightness, sunlight bouncing off the pale facades along Via Roma and catching the glint of wet cobblestones from the night's light rain. Riccobono steps out from his villa just as a vendor pushes a cart of fresh artichokes toward the market, calling out prices in a voice worn by years of dawn starts. He nods to the man, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets as he heads for the cafe near the piazza. There is a rhythm to his life, built not on urgency, but on deliberate presence. Part of that rhythm is honoring the old codes, the kind that once bound Palermo's neighborhoods like threads in a tapestry. These codes aren't written, but they're enforced in ways more lasting than any printed law. Respect elders, protect the family, never bring trouble to your own doorstep, and above all, keep disputes within the circle, never spilling them onto the streets for outsiders to see. He learned those codes from men who had lived through leaner, harder decades, men who remembered the post-war hunger and the quiet desperation that turned smuggling from vice into survival. They passed on not just the rules, but the stories of favors repaid 20 years later, of insults remembered until the day they could be answered. Riccobono keeps those tales alive, weaving them into his own conduct. A historical truth fits neatly here. By the early 1980s, these old-world traditions were eroding. Younger men, impatient, flush with ambitions sharpened by the heroin trade, cared less for ceremony and more for quick results. Many people still think that the old guard and the new generation could coexist without friction, but in truth, their values clashed quietly at first, then violently. Riccobono, with his polished manners and quiet authority, stood at the fault line. That morning, he meets with two men from an older faction at a shaded corner table of the cafe. They talk about the upcoming feast day of Santa Rosalia, about ensuring that certain vendors get the best spots along the procession route. It sounds harmless, but in the undercurrent of their words lies the negotiation of territory, of who gets to collect from which stall. Riccobono listens more than he speaks, occasionally adding a word that tilts the balance without making it obvious. After the meeting, he walks the narrow back streets toward the church. A wedding party spills onto the steps, bride radiant in lace, guests tossing rice, the air full of laughter and camera flashes. Riccobono lingers just long enough for the father of the bride to spot him. They exchange a handshake that lasts a beat too long to be casual. Later, guests will remember his presence as a sign of honor, though no one will say exactly why. In the afternoon, he visits an elderly man named Don Ernesto. once a feared figure in the port district, now confined to a chair on his balcony. They share a glass of wine and talk about the changing city, how the young men carry pistols instead of pocket knives, how the language of respect is fading. Ernesto sighs, shaking his head, and mutters, "They don't know that patience is the sharpest blade." Riccobono smiles faintly, knowing he will carry that line with him. As dusk falls, he walks home along the seawall, the waves breaking against the rocks in a steady rhythm. The old codes may be fraying, but as long as he moves through Palermo like this, measured, deliberate, and bound by the invisible rules, he believes he can keep the threads from snapping entirely. The trick is to honor the past while keeping an eye on the tide coming in. Late afternoon sunlight settles over Palermo like a soft shawl, turning the surface of the Tyrrhenian Sea into sheets of gold. Along the promenade, couples stroll slowly. Children chase one another near the benches, and the air hums with the mingled scent of salt water and roasted chestnuts. Riccobono walks at his usual unhurried pace toward the end of the pier, where the shadows of fishing boats sway on the water's skin. He has always known the value of being seen in the right company. This is why, on certain days, he makes sure to appear alongside men in uniform, always in public, always framed as cordial acquaintances rather than conspirators. One such man is Captain Lovecchio, a local police officer whose father once worked the docks with Riccobono's father. Their bond is rooted in shared history, which makes their occasional chance meetings seem harmless to outsiders. Today, they lean on the pier railing, gazing out toward the horizon. They talk about the incoming weather, about the increase in tourist traffic from mainland Italy, and about the rise in petty theft near the bus terminal. On the surface, it's all civic concern. Beneath, Lovecchio quietly confirms that a certain inspector, prone to meddling, has been reassigned inland. Riccobono nods as if the news is of passing interest. Historically, local law enforcement in Sicily during the 1980s was a complex network of loyalties, some official, some personal. Many people still think that every officer was either wholly clean or wholly corrupt, but in reality, the truth was far murkier. Friendships, family ties, and the quiet exchange of favors blurred the lines until no one could say for certain where duty ended and loyalty began. As they part ways, Riccobono's walk takes him past the small guardhouse near the marina entrance. A younger officer stands there, straight-backed but clearly bored, tapping the toe of his boot against the stone. Riccobono greets him warmly, remembering his name and asking after his mother, who works at a bakery near Vucciria Market. The young man's face brightens. These small courtesies cost nothing but often return tenfold. He continues inland, passing a fruit vendor who discreetly slips him a paper bag of figs without taking payment. It's not a bribe, it's a gesture, one of countless tiny threads in the web Riccobono maintains. In return, the vendor knows his stall will remain untroubled by sudden inspections or disputes with neighboring sellers. By early evening, he is seated at his favorite table in a small trattoria with a view of the harbor. The owner, Signora Belanti, has kept it for him without needing to be asked. A plate of grilled sardines arrives, followed by a carafe of wine, both chosen without consultation. He eats slowly, savoring the meal, occasionally greeting passers-by with a nod or a raised glass. For many, this image, of the gentleman dining quietly, framed by the sea, confirms their sense that he is simply a man of refined tastes. For others, it's a reminder that every movement here, every conversation, happens in his shadow. When the sky turns fully dark, the harbor lights flicker on, casting long reflections across the water. Riccobono finishes his wine, thanks the signora, and steps into the cool evening air. The city around him seems calm, but he knows better. Calm is just another word for a surface waiting to break. The next morning arrives with a low haze rolling off the sea, muting the colors of the coast. The fishing boats look like faded postcards, their outlines softened by the mist. Riccobono stands on the veranda of his villa, sipping espresso from a porcelain cup, eyes on the slow movement of the tide. To most, it's just another quiet day in Mondello. To him, it's an ideal cover. Beyond the breakwater lies the lifeblood of his quieter operations, the coastal smuggling routes that stretch like invisible veins along the length of Sicily. They run north toward Naples, west to Sardinia, and even farther to the North African coast. Some routes are centuries old, once used by fishermen avoiding heavy tariffs. Others are newer, born of the 20th century's shifting markets. Riccobono's genius is not in creating them, but in refining them, making them so smooth and ordinary-looking that no one notices until it's too late. A small fishing boat, the Santa Lucia, comes into view, moving at a lazy pace. It's painted in cheerful blues and yellows, its nets hanging to dry. To the untrained eye, it's carrying nothing but the morning's modest catch. In truth, beneath a false floor in the storage hold, there's cargo bound for a warehouse outside Palermo, cargo that won't appear in any ledger. Riccobono doesn't need to be there to oversee it. His presence would draw the wrong kind of attention. Instead, he maintains distance, trusting the men who've proven themselves over years of silent work. Historically, the use of fishing vessels for smuggling was so common along the Mediterranean that entire port towns depended on the income, directly or indirectly. Many people still think that these runs were dangerous, tense affairs, but in reality, the best ones were boring. Calm trips where the most stressful part was docking without waking the customs officer's dog. Riccobono preferred it that way. Later that morning, he takes a walk through the marina, greeting the crews of several moored boats. Each greeting is a small inspection. He notes which men seem tired, which boats look freshly scrubbed, and which captains avoid his gaze. There's no confrontation. Information, for now, is enough. By midday, the Santa Lucia has docked at a smaller pier to the west, where crates are unloaded with the same casual air as any legal shipment. A portion of the cargo, barrels marked anchovies, is quietly shifted to a truck bound for the city. Riccobono is already elsewhere by then, sitting in a modest cafe reading the newspaper, but the timing is no accident. From his table, he sees the local harbor master pass by, offering a polite wave. They exchange brief words about the coming storm, both men knowing the real conversation is the one they are not having. In Riccobono's world, absence can be as telling as presence. His decision not to show up at the pier says as much as if he had. By the time the mist lifts in the afternoon, the goods are already inland, moving along roads that twist between olive groves and low hills. On the coast, the water sparkles again under the sun, as if nothing at all has happened. For Riccobono, that's the measure of success. The day looks exactly the same to everyone else. The late afternoon light slides across Palermo's harbor, casting the warehouses in warm bronze and catching the slow sway of moored fishing boats. Riccobono walks with measured steps toward a small wine shop tucked into a side street near the port. It's an unremarkable place to most. Dusty shelves, a quiet hum from an old refrigerator. But to him, it's one of the keys to his reach beyond Sicily. The shop is owned by Vincenzo, a man in his 60s with a perpetual half-smile and a ledger as meticulous as a banker's. Officially, he sells Sicilian wine to restaurants along the coast. Unofficially, the shipments include carefully packed crates bound for foreign ports, Marseille, Barcelona, even as far as Boston. These are the silent partners Riccobono has cultivated for years, each one a strand in a net that stretches far past the Tyrrhenian Sea. They sit in the shop's back room where the air smells of oak barrels and faintly of tobacco. Vincenzo pours 2 glasses of Nero d'Avola, and they talk about the harvest, the market prices, and the uptick in French buyers. Midway through, Vincenzo slides a folded piece of paper across the table. Inside is a list of port schedules, not meant for public eyes. Riccobono scans it briefly, then folds it again and tucks it into his jacket. A historical note fits seamlessly here. By the early 1980s, international trafficking networks often disguised their exchanges through perfectly legitimate businesses. Many people still think that these connections were built overnight through daring smuggling runs, but in truth, they were the result of years, sometimes decades, of quiet, careful trust building. Riccobono understood that trust was a more reliable currency than cash. From Vincenzo's shop, the conversation extends to names in other cities. A man in Marseille who can move goods off a dock without paperwork. A restaurant owner in Valencia who stores shipments in his wine cellar until they can be moved inland. Each partner is kept at arm's length. No one sees the whole map except Riccobono himself. After an hour, he leaves with nothing more than a polite wave to the shopkeeper and a small paper bag containing a bottle of wine. To any passerby, he is just a man buying a vintage for dinner. Yet within that small exchange lies the coordination of a network that spans borders. On his way back toward the marina, he stops at a kiosk selling roasted almonds. The vendor, a young woman with sharp eyes, slips a small envelope into the bag before handing it over. No one else notices. Riccobono nods once and moves on, the faint salt of almonds mingling with the scent of the sea in the evening air. As darkness begins to fall, he stands for a while at the end of the pier, watching the lights of the larger ships offshore. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, are men who know his name but have never seen his face. That is how he prefers it. His presence felt without ever being obvious. His influence carried across waters like the tide itself. The wind off the sea has cooled by the time Riccobono makes his way toward Mondello that evening, the streets humming with the relaxed energy of locals slipping into night. Lights from the waterfront restaurants flicker across the water, mingling with the yellow halos of street lamps. Tonight, he isn't here to oversee shipments or settle disputes, at least not in any overt sense. Tonight, it's about cementing a pact. The dinner is set in a private room at a small restaurant known only to those who can afford both the menu and the discretion. The tables are covered in crisp white linen, candles flickering in glass holders, and the air is rich with the scent of grilled swordfish. Riccobono arrives exactly on time, as he always does. Not early, which might suggest eagerness, and never late, which might hint at disrespect. Inside, 2 men are waiting. One is an older associate from the Palermo construction sector, a man whose handshake carries the weight of decades of city contracts. The other is a younger figure from Catania, dressed sharply, with the watchful eyes of someone who knows a single misstep could ruin him. They rise as Riccobono enters, and after the formal greetings, they sit. The conversation begins with wine. Its vintage, its vineyard, its pairing with the evening's courses. Then, Like the slow turning of a tide, it drifts toward the real matter, a lucrative shipping opportunity that could double the reach of certain imports. No one uses the word contraband. Instead, they speak in the language of cargo diversification and coastal efficiency. Historically, such meetings often took place in settings like this, public enough to be normal, private enough to keep prying ears at bay. Many people still think that high-level agreements were struck in smoky backrooms or crumbling warehouses. In reality, they were often sealed over wine glasses and seafood platters, with soft laughter covering the weight of what was being decided. Riccobono listens, nodding occasionally, letting the younger man explain the logistical advantages of using secondary docks in Calabria to avoid scrutiny. The older associate fills in details about political connections that could ensure smooth passage. Riccobono says little until the end, when dessert arrives, small almond pastries dusted with sugar. He leans in slightly, his voice calm, and states that the deal will proceed only if every party involved commits to one condition: no unnecessary risks. That means no flashy purchases, no sudden changes in crew, no deviations from established routes. The younger man nods quickly, perhaps too quickly, but Riccobono lets it pass for now. By the time they rise from the table, the candles have burned low, and the hum of the restaurant has quieted. Outside, the sea air is cool, carrying the faint sounds of laughter from a nearby gelato shop. The pact is sealed, not with a handshake or a signature, but with the mutual understanding that each man now has a piece of the other's future in his hands. As Riccobono walks back toward his car, the moonlight glints off the cobblestones, and he allows himself a small, private smile. In his world, victories aren't loud. They're quiet enough to pass for nothing at all. The days that follow are a blur of small movements, each one calibrated to keep the peace between Palermo's volatile neighborhoods. In 1982, the city is a chessboard where every square is claimed by someone, sometimes by more than one someone. And Riccobono knows that even a single wrong step can ripple into weeks of trouble. On a warm Thursday afternoon, he makes his way to a narrow street in the Calza district, a place where faded Baroque balconies lean over laundry lines, and the smell of frying sardines drifts from kitchen windows. Here, two factions have been circling each other for weeks, their quarrel beginning with an insult over territory, but growing into a matter of pride. It's not yet violent, but the tension is thick enough to weigh in the air. Riccobono arrives without an entourage, just one driver waiting discreetly in the car at the far end of the street. He steps into a small cafe where the first faction has gathered. 4 men, all in their 30s, their voices lowered but sharp. He orders an espresso, sits at a table within earshot, and lets his presence do the talking for several minutes. It works. The men shift their tone, glancing at him in the mirror behind the bar. Once the conversation softens, he crosses the street to a tailor shop, where members of the other faction wait among bolts of fabric and the hiss of an iron. Here, the mood is more defensive, arms crossed, voices tight. Riccobono listens to their grievances without interruption, then leans in just slightly and says, "If you're fighting in the street, someone else is profiting from it. Do you really want to work for them?" The words land. No agreement is signed, but when he leaves, both sides know they've been measured by the same scale. Historically, local power in Palermo's neighborhoods depended not just on strength, but on the ability to mediate without humiliation. Many people still think that such mediations were purely selfless acts to maintain order. In reality, every peace brokered, strengthened the hand of the man who brokered it, adding another thread to his control. Later that evening, Riccobono strolls through the Palermo market as vendors pack up for the night. He stops to buy a bundle of fresh herbs from an old woman who has sold there for decades. She thanks him not just for the purchase, but for keeping the boys quiet, a remark she delivers with the faintest smile. By the time Riccobono returns to his villa, the city has settled into its nighttime rhythm. The distant thrum of scooters, the hum of conversation spilling from balconies, the occasional bark of a dog in the narrow streets. The factions may still distrust each other, but the immediate storm has passed. That's all he needs for now. Breathing space, bought not with threats, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows how to keep the board from tipping. A pale dawn settles over Palermo, the city wrapped in that brief hour when the noise of the day has yet to intrude. Riccobono stands at his study window, a cup of strong coffee in hand, gazing toward the distant dome of the Parliament building. It rises above the patchwork of terracotta rooftops, gilded by the early sun, a reminder that power in this city is not only held on the streets. He has never been a politician, but he understands the machinery of politics well enough to nudge its gears. His influence moves subtly through the corridors of the Palazzo dei Normanni, where certain members of the regional assembly owe favors that can't be repaid with money alone. These connections are cultivated not through backroom smoke-filled deals, those are for lesser tacticians, but through a web of public courtesies and quiet assurances. Mid-morning finds him walking the grand steps of a government building, dressed impeccably, his polished shoes tapping evenly on the marble. He is not here officially. His name is nowhere on the day's appointment list, but he knows precisely which minister will be leaving through the side entrance after a meeting. The encounter is brief. A handshake, a comment about the minister's speech from the previous week, a casual remark about shipping tariffs that just happens to align with Riccobono's current interests. The minister smiles thinly, understanding the real weight behind the small talk. Historically, the 1980s in Sicily saw organized crime moving ever closer to the political sphere. Many people still think that the two worlds were separated by rigid walls. In truth, they shared doors, some hidden, some wide open, through which influence flowed quietly in both directions. Riccobono never pushed those doors open too far, but he made sure they stayed unlocked. In the afternoon, he meets with a lawyer in a quiet office above a bookstore. The meeting is framed as a discussion about zoning laws for coastal properties, but woven into the conversation are veiled references to upcoming city council votes, the placement of police patrols, and which construction firms might receive public contracts. The lawyer, an old friend from school days, speaks with the measured caution of someone who knows their client's shadow stretches farther than most people's sight. Afterward, Riccobono walks the length of Via Vittorio Emanuele, past the cathedral's imposing facade, the street alive now with vendors, tourists, and students. He stops briefly at a newspaper stand, scanning headlines that speak of political disputes in Rome, none of which mention the smaller, quieter currents flowing here in Palermo. That's exactly how he prefers it. By evening, he returns to his villa, where a small dinner is arranged for two local business owners. Over plates of pasta, con le sarde, they talk about coastal property values, about how the upcoming tourist season might swell the market. Between sips of wine, Riccobono makes a single suggestion, just a change in timing for their next investment, and leaves the rest unsaid. They will take the hint. They always do. As the night deepens, the glow from the Parliament dome fades into darkness. In the city below, deals are made, alliances are tested, and tomorrow's speeches are drafted. Riccobono closes the shutters, knowing that in Palermo, the threads between politics and the street are invisible until they're pulled. Rain moves in from the sea overnight, and by morning, Palermo wakes under a soft, gray veil. The streets glisten, the air heavy with the scent of wet stone and diesel. In the port district, puddles gather in the uneven cobblestones, and shopkeepers sweep water from their thresholds. Riccobono leaves his villa later than usual, his pace unhurried, his eyes alert for the subtle signs that bad weather brings. Less chatter on the street, more glances over shoulders. It is on days like this that rumors travel fastest. A whispered warning slips from one market stall to another, carried between the click of scales weighing fish and the hiss of oil in frying pans. This morning, the talk is about betrayal, not yet proven, but already poisonous. A shipment that should have arrived 2 nights ago never made it to the agreed drop point. The missing cargo is valuable, but it's the uncertainty that concerns Riccobono most. In his world, suspicion is as dangerous as truth. He stops first at a tobacco shop where an old acquaintance leans behind the counter. They exchange pleasantries. Then the man lowers his voice, mentioning a name, someone who has been seen meeting with a rival from across town. Riccobono's expression doesn't change, but he files it away, like a chess player marking a pawn's unexpected move. A historical note settles into the scene. The early 1980s were marked by an uneasy calm in Palermo's underworld, a calm easily shattered by whispers. Many people still think that betrayals were loud and violent from the start. In truth, they often began as small shifts in behavior. A meeting at the wrong cafe, a delay in payment, a look that lingered too long. The wise noticed them before the storm broke. In the afternoon, Riccobono walks through the old quarter, the rain now a light drizzle. He steps into a bakery where 2 men sit in the corner, their conversation halting as he enters. One of them offers a forced smile, the other avoids his gaze entirely. Riccobono orders a loaf of bread, pays an exact change, and leaves without a word. Sometimes silence is more unsettling than questions. Later, he meets with one of his most trusted lieutenants, a man named Giulio, in the back of a shuttered gelato shop. Giulio swears the missing shipment was sabotaged, though he cannot yet prove it. He suggests a list of names, but Riccobono shakes his head. Acting too quickly could push a false suspicion into an irreversible truth. He orders patience instead, a frustrating but often lethal strategy in his hands. As evening falls, the rain finally clears, leaving the city washed and reflective under the streetlights. Riccobono stands at his study window, watching the slick streets curve toward the harbor. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened to the shipment. For now, he will let them believe the rumor has not reached his ears. Let them think the tide is still calm. When it turns, it will turn without warning. The morning after the rain smells of seaweed and clean stone, the sky a crisp blue that seems almost at odds with the talk running through Palermo's narrow streets. Riccobono rises early, stepping into the courtyard of his villa, where the lemon trees glisten from last night's moisture. A quiet summons has already gone out. 3 messages sent, each delivered by a different hand, to men who understand that when he calls without explanation, it's not a social visit. By mid-morning, he is seated in the back corner of a modest trattoria near the waterfront, a place chosen for its plainness. It's the sort of spot where fishermen drink wine in small glasses and tourists rarely linger. The first man arrives, nodding silently before taking a seat. The second comes minutes later, glancing briefly toward the door before sliding into the booth. The third, a younger man with sharp eyes and restless hands, enters last. Riccobono speaks sparingly, letting the weight of the silence pull them into focus. He mentions the missing shipment without accusation, then outlines what he's heard. Names floated in whispers, sightings in cafes known to host rivals. He does not raise his voice. Instead, he tells them plainly that Palermo's coast survives on balance, and that balance doesn't allow for mistakes to turn into examples. One of the men shifts uncomfortably, offering a denial that's more hurried than convincing. Riccobono doesn't press him. Instead, he leans back, takes a slow sip of wine, and changes the subject to the weekend's fishing conditions. It's a move designed to unsettle, the signal that he knows more than he is saying, and that there will be a time and a place for the truth to surface. Historically, quiet warnings like this often carried more weight than threats. Many people still think that men in Riccobono's position relied on fear alone, but fear is clumsy when overused. Suspense, letting a man sit with the question of what you know, is sharper, cleaner, and harder to escape. That evening, as the sun sinks behind Monte Pellegrino, Riccobono takes a walk along the seawall. A light breeze rolls in off the water, carrying the distant sound of church bells. He stops near a small fishing hut, where an older man sits mending nets. They exchange a few words about the upcoming feast of Santa Rosalia, but beneath them runs an unspoken current. The old man has heard things about who's been seen speaking to whom. When Riccobono returns to his villa, the city is settling into night. From the balcony, he watches headlights thread along the coastal road. Somewhere among those moving lights are the answers to his questions. For now, the warning he's given will ripple through the right circles. And when the ripples reach the source, they'll know exactly who sent them. Without a single explicit threat, the days grow shorter in late autumn, and with them comes a subtle tightening in Palermo's air, a shift in tone that even the tourists can sense. By early evening, the sun is already melting into the horizon, and the street lamps glow against the darkening sea. Riccobono walks alone toward the western edge of the city, where the buildings thin out and the coastal road runs almost silent. A trusted contact has asked to meet here, far from the usual cafes and markets. The rendezvous spot is an abandoned watchtower, its stone worn smooth by centuries of wind. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of salt and moss. Waiting for him is Tommaso, a man whose reliability has never been in question, until now. They greet each other with a handshake, but the warmth doesn't last. Riccobono leans against the wall, studying Tommaso's face as the man explains the trouble. A payment meant for one of their suppliers in Sardinia never arrived. The courier swears he delivered it. The supplier swears he never saw it. In between those two swears lies either a mistake or a theft, and either can be fatal to trust. Riccobono listens without interrupting, letting the silence after each statement stretch long enough to make Tommaso uneasy. Then, quietly, he asks a single question. Who benefits if this becomes an argument between us? The answer is obvious, and it is not someone in the room. A historical fact presses into the moment. In the fractured networks of 1980s Sicily, disputes between allies often played directly into a rival's hands. Many people still think that such fractures happened by accident. In truth, They were often engineered by a third party, someone stirring trouble in one corner to gain advantage in another. Before they part, Riccobono tells Tommaso he will handle the matter personally. It is both a reassurance and a test. If Tommaso is innocent, the intervention will clear his name. If he is guilty, the same attention will corner him. That night, Riccobono returns to his villa and sits in his study with the lamp low, a map of Sicily spread before him. His finger traces the routes between Palermo and Sardinia, lingering over the points where cargo changes hands. Somewhere along that route lies the truth. He closes the map and leans back, letting the quiet of the room settle around him. The next morning breaks pale and cold, the kind of Sicilian winter light that flattens colors and sharpens edges. From his veranda, Riccobono can see the rooftops glittering faintly where frost has touched them in the night. Down by the marina, a police car idles near the pier, a reminder that the state's eyes, once looking elsewhere, are turning toward him and his circle. Word has reached him that certain officials have begun inquiring not just about his businesses, but about the people closest to him. This is the kind of attention that doesn't come from coincidence. Someone has given them a reason. He starts the day quietly, breakfasting with Maria, his sister, who has stopped by under the pretext of delivering olive oil from her in-laws in Trapani. They speak about family matters, her children, her husband's work in the wine trade. But beneath her careful tone, he senses worry. She mentions a stranger seen loitering near her building. Riccobono reassures her with a calm smile, but his mind is already noting the pattern. By mid-morning, he is seated in the back room of a print shop, meeting with Giulio and another trusted man, Pietro. Spread before them is a map of the city marked with pins: blue for friends, red for rivals, green for uncertain. A small cluster of red pins has appeared uncomfortably close to green ones near the market district, where his nephew often spends time. Riccobono traces a circle around the area with the tip of his finger. These need to change color, he says simply. Historically, when law enforcement tightened its gaze on a figure like Riccobono, the danger wasn't only arrest, it was the erosion of trust within the circle. Many people still think that surveillance alone was enough to topple a network. In reality, the fear it sowed could do more damage than any raid. As allies began to distance themselves before the noose tightened, in the afternoon, he makes a public appearance in a way only he can, visiting a community event at the church, handing out envelopes for the poor, shaking hands with parish leaders. Cameras from a local paper capture him smiling warmly, a civic-minded gentleman with no reason to hide from scrutiny. It is both a shield and a message. He is still here, still moving as if nothing has changed. By evening, he is back at the villa, a fire lit in the hearth. Papers lie in neat stacks on the desk beside him, shipping manifests, coded notes, lists of names and dates. He works through them methodically, cross-referencing small details that others might overlook. Outside, the frost begins to form again on the garden walls, the air so still that even the lemon leaves seem frozen in place. He closes the last folder just before midnight, leaning back in his chair. The state may be watching, but so is he. And unlike them, he doesn't have to follow the rules. Winter grips Palermo with a damp chill, the kind that seeps into stone walls and lingers in the bones. On this particular night, a convoy of black sedans moves quietly through the outskirts of the city, their headlights dimmed, engines purring low. Inside one of them, Riccobono sits in the back seat, his coat collar turned up, the rhythmic thrum of tires on uneven asphalt the only sound. He is on his way to a gathering unlike the usual dinners or market strolls, a meeting of the higher echelons, drawn together under the unspoken urgency of shifting alliances. The venue is a secluded villa outside Bagheria, far enough from the city to keep attention at bay, close enough for every attendee to reach within an hour. When he arrives, the gravel crunches underfoot as he steps out. The night air is heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the villa's grand hall is lit by a long chandelier, casting warm light over a polished table that could seat 24. Around it, men exchange measured greetings, each handshake a negotiation in miniature. Historically, the winter of 1982 saw the Sicilian underworld in flux. The Second Mafia War was already reshaping power, and gatherings like this were not mere formalities. They were opportunities to draw new boundaries. Many people still think that such meetings were about plotting single acts of violence. In reality, they were about securing months, even years of position and survival. The conversation flows in low tones, broken occasionally by the clink of glasses or the scrape of a chair. Riccobono listens more than he speaks, his gaze steady on the men who dominate the discussion. When the talk turns to the coastal routes, a lifeline for both legal trade and its shadow twin, he interjects with a proposal that protects his territory without appearing defensive. His suggestion is framed as mutual benefit, smoother operations for everyone, fewer disputes in the ports. Later, as smaller groups break off to speak in corners, Riccobono steps out to the terrace. The night stretches black over the hills, broken only by the faint lights of fishing boats far off in the water. He's joined by an older figure from Catania, a man whose word still carries weight despite the younger generation's impatience. They speak briefly about the old days, how disputes were settled with words before they were settled with bullets, and agree that those days are not likely to return. By the time the meeting ends, the air is colder, the damp seeping deeper into the gravel road. Riccobono rides back toward Palermo in silence, the city's glow growing brighter with each mile. The gathering has not solved everything. It never does. But it has drawn certain lines in the sand. And for now, his position on the Palermo coast remains intact. The days after the Bagheria gathering carry a faint hum of watchfulness, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Riccobono moves through Palermo with the same measured calm as always, but beneath that composure is a sharpened awareness. Every visit to the docks, every stop at a cafe, is a quiet check on whether the new lines drawn at the meeting are holding. One afternoon, he takes the coastal road west towards Riccobono, where the sea crashes hard against the rocks and gulls wheel overhead. Here, beyond the postcard charm of fishing nets and weathered boats, lies one of the invisible borders agreed upon at the villa, a stretch of coast no rival will trespass on without provoking a response. At the harbor, he meets with Alfio, the captain of a modest fishing vessel that doubles as a courier for sensitive cargo. They walk the length of the pier, speaking softly about catch sizes and repair schedules, but their eyes scan the waterline, noting which boats are docked and which are absent. One absence in particular, a vessel from Catania that had been a regular visitor, confirms that the new territorial lines are being observed, at least for now. Historically, these boundaries were rarely written down, but were as binding as any legal treaty. Many people still think that control of territory in the mafia world was enforced only through open displays of power. In truth, much of it was upheld through mutual recognition, reinforced by occasional reminders when someone tested the edges. By late afternoon, Riccobono stops at a small roadside cafe overlooking the water. The owner greets him warmly, serving espresso without asking. As they speak about the weather and the coming fishing festival, the owner slips in a mention of strangers seen asking questions about Riccobono's roots. The warning is quiet, almost casual, but it carries weight. He thanks her, pays in cash, and leaves the change untouched on the counter. On the drive back to Palermo, the coastline glows under a winter sunset, the water deep blue under streaks of orange and gold. From the passenger seat, Giulio points out a truck heading toward the city loaded with crates of salted fish. A shipment that, Riccobono knows, also carries something less edible in its false bottom pallets. He says nothing, just watches until the truck is out of sight. That evening, back at his villa, he studies a map of the western coast spread across his desk. Small markers indicate the new boundaries, the routes, the trusted harbors. His fingertip rests on Riccobono for a moment longer than the others. Holding a territory is never about planting a flag. It's about making the cost of crossing it too high for anyone to risk. For now, that cost is understood. The first chill of February sweeps in from the sea, bringing with it a sharper edge to the wind and to the mood on the streets. Palermo still moves with its usual rhythm. Vendors calling out in the markets, scooters buzzing between traffic. But beneath the daily noise lies the constant hum of pride, insult, and unspoken challenges. For Riccobono, the next test comes not from a rival's knife or a police file, but from words spoken in the wrong tone. It happens in a small bar near the Vucciria market. A young man from a family allied to Riccobono's makes an offhand remark, dismissing the old guard as relics. The words travel faster than the young man realizes, repeated over grappa glasses until they reach Riccobono by evening. On their own, they're almost nothing. But in this world, letting such a slight pass unanswered invites worse. The next day, Riccobono walks into the same bar just after lunch. The air smells of fried pennel and red wine, the light dim through frosted windows. Conversations falter when he enters. The young man is there, standing by the counter, trying to look casual. Riccobono approaches, his steps unhurried. He greets the man warmly, asks after his mother, even compliments the tie he's wearing. Then, with a voice low enough to be heard only by him, he says, "A gentleman never mistakes courtesy for weakness." The young man swallows hard, nods, and mutters an apology. Riccobono smiles, pats his shoulder, and orders an espresso. The room exhales again, historically. In the mafia culture of the 1980s, an insult was rarely about the words themselves. It was about the shift in perception they could cause. Many people still think that every offense was met with violence. In truth, the smartest leaders handled small slights with precision, turning them into reminders rather than wars. That evening, Riccobono attends a wedding in Mondello. He is seated near the front, where the bride's father makes a point of toasting him during the reception. The young man from the bar is also there, seated at a table far from the head, his eyes lowered whenever Riccobono's gaze passes over him. The point has been made, and no blood has been spilled. As the night winds down, Riccobono steps outside for a moment, the sea air cool against his face. Behind him, music drifts from the reception hall, accordion and laughter, the sound of a city that still knows how to celebrate. In his world, keeping composure in the face of an insult is not a sign of restraint. It's a signal that he chooses his battles, and when he does, he wins them. Spring arrives slowly on the Palermo coast. the air still carrying a faint chill even as the markets begin to fill with the first green artichokes and crates of bright strawberries. Riccobono moves through the streets with the same measured calm, but his attention is fixed on a different kind of work, covering the traces of his deeper operations beneath the smooth surface of legitimate business. The front this season is a series of coastal investment projects, small fishing cooperatives, a refrigerated storage facility, even a modest boat repair yard. Each of these ventures operates exactly as advertised. Fishermen do unload their catch, repairs are made on hulls, and tourists do buy fresh seafood. But within these everyday rhythms, Riccobono has built spaces where his other business can breathe unnoticed. One morning, he visits the new storage facility, walking through the chilled rooms where crates of fish are stacked neatly against the walls. The smell of salt and ice fills the air. A clipboard is pressed into his hand by the foreman, listing incoming shipments. He scans the page, noting certain entries marked with a faint dot in the margin, goods that will take a different route after dark. Historically, laundering illicit operations through legitimate fronts was not unique to Sicily, but Riccobono approached it with unusual subtlety. Many people still think that the disguise was always thin, obvious to anyone looking. His approach made the front as valuable as the hidden layer beneath, so that dismantling one would harm people far outside his circle, making interference a risk few wanted to take. In the afternoon, he walks through the boatyard, greeting mechanics as they work on hulls pulled from the water. A man sanding a keel steps aside to let him pass, nodding respectfully. Riccobono inspects a mid-sized trawler, noting the reinforced compartments added under the deck. Out loud, he comments only on the quality of the work. By evening, he is seated at a seaside cafe, watching the fishing boats return. From his vantage point, it looks like nothing more than a typical day on the Palermo coast. The storage facility will continue to handle its crates, the boatyard will finish its repairs, and the cooperative will sell fresh fish at tomorrow's market. To anyone watching casually, these are just signs of a man with a hand in local commerce. As the sun dips into the water, painting the horizon in deep orange, Riccobono sips his espresso slowly. Smoke screens are most effective when they're beautiful enough for people to admire, then forget to question. The first real heat of the year arrives on a day when the sky is cloudless and the sea looks like hammered glass. Riccobono leaves the villa early, the sound of cicadas already rising from the gardens. He prefers to walk to the marina on days like this, less for the exercise, more for the quiet time to think. Halfway along the coastal road, a black sedan slows briefly as it passes, the driver offering a small, respectful nod. Riccobono notes the license plate without looking directly at it. He has a long memory for details, and small sightings often matter more than dramatic confrontations. Today's concern comes from the far side of the city, an ambush narrowly avoided 2 nights ago by one of his couriers. The man had been driving a small truck along a coastal stretch between Casteldaccia and Palermo when another car tried to force him toward the cliff's edge. He escaped, shaken but unharmed, abandoning the truck at a roadside cafe and phoning Giulio before making his way back. At the marina, Riccobono boards a modest motorboat and asks the captain to take him out along the coast. The water is calm, the wake spreading behind them in thin silver lines. As they pass the stretch of road where the attack happened, Riccobono studies the curves and the blind spots, noting how easy it would be to stage an accident there. He doesn't speak, but the captain, an old hand who has ferried him many times, keeps his eyes forward, understanding the mood. Historically, incidents like this were rarely random. Many people still think that ambushes in the mafia world were spur-of-the-moment acts of vengeance. In reality, they were planned with meticulous attention to timing, geography, and escape routes. This one, Riccobono suspects, was meant not to kill, but to send a warning. Back on shore, he walks into a small ship repair shed at the far end of the pier. Inside, a mechanic is bent over an engine, but straightens when Riccobono enters. They speak briefly about repairs, about fishing routes, and between the lines, about the fact that the men responsible for the roadside encounter are not from Palermo. That, in some ways, makes it worse. Outsiders testing the waters can be unpredictable. By evening, he sits in his study, the day's heat still lingering in the air. A map of the coastal road lies open before him, next to a list of names written in his own hand. Some are crossed out, some underlined. He isn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. What he feels is closer to resolve, the kind that waits for the exact tide before moving. The following week brings a restless mood to the Palermo coast. Riccobono senses it in the way conversations pause when he steps into a room, in how familiar faces linger a beat too long before offering their usual greetings. His network is still intact, but small shifts in tone and timing tell him that confidence in his position is beginning to fray. It starts with a meeting at the back of a wholesale produce market. The air smells of ripe tomatoes and basil, the chatter of vendors bouncing off the high walls. Two of his longest-standing partners are there, men he has known since the early days, when cargo moved in fishing boats rather than cargo ships. They talk about a shipment from Spain, but their voices carry a hesitancy that wasn't there before. One asks, almost casually, whether Riccobono has everything under control after the roadside incident. It's not the words, but the way they're said, a question disguised as reassurance. He answers with a calm smile, speaking of steady operations and the reliability of old alliances. But inside, he knows that questions like this spread. Later that afternoon, he visits a small barber shop in the Albergaria district. The barber, a wiry man in his 50s, greets him warmly and begins trimming his hair with the same precision as always. Between snips, he mentions that some people have been meeting at a certain cafe on the edge of the old quarter. People who used to speak openly of their loyalty to Riccobono, but now speak of options. The word hangs in the air like a blade. Historically, loyalty within Cosa Nostra was a fluid thing, especially during periods of instability. Many people still think that once a man swore allegiance, it was unshakable. In truth, allegiance was often recalculated against the shifting weight of opportunity and risk. That evening, Riccobono invites a handful of key allies to his villa for a dinner. The setting is warm, the food carefully chosen, the wine flowing just enough to loosen conversation without dulling memory. He makes no speeches, but he works the table slowly, ensuring each man leaves with a personal exchange, an inside joke, a shared memory, a subtle reminder of debts owed and favors given. By the time the last guest departs, the villa is quiet except for the ticking of the clock in the hall. Riccobono stands at the window overlooking the darkened garden. The night is still, but he knows stillness can be deceptive. The question is not whether someone will test him again. It's when and how prepared they'll be when they do. The summer heat arrives early that year, settling over Palermo like a heavy curtain. Even the sea breeze feels warm, carrying the scent of salt, tar, and sun-baked stone. Riccobono moves through his days with outward ease, but each one brings a sharper edge to the quiet threats pressing at his position. One evening, Giulio brings word of an unexpected visit. Two men from out of town, seen asking questions in the markets and near the docks. They're careful, polite even, but their inquiries have a pattern. They want to know about routes, about schedules, about which warehouses see the most activity after dark. Outsiders with too much curiosity are rarely harmless. The next day, Riccobono takes a slow walk through the old fish market at dawn, when the air is cool and the stalls are stacked high with glistening catch. He greets the vendors as always, pausing to inspect sardines, to taste a sliver of swordfish fresh from the blade. It's routine on the surface, but his eyes are searching, looking for the unfamiliar faces in the crowd. Near the far end of the market, he spots them. Not together, not obviously connected, but both out of place. One dressed too sharply for the setting, the other with the stance of someone watching more than buying. He passes them without a pause, his expression unreadable, but the sight cements his decision. This will not be ignored. Historically, the infiltration of rival agents into a city's operations was often the first step toward larger encroachment. Many people still think that territory was lost in sudden, decisive battles. In reality, it often slipped away through small, quiet advances that went unchecked. Riccobono knows this, and he knows the remedy is swift, precise correction. That afternoon, he arranges for a seemingly casual dinner at a seaside trattoria, inviting a mix of allies and associates from the docks. Over plates of grilled calamari and wine, conversation turns, subtly, toward the value of keeping Palermo's affairs in Palermo's hands. No names are mentioned, but the implication is clear. Those at the table will repeat the message elsewhere, and soon the entire waterfront will hum with the warning. As the sun sinks into the horizon, Riccobono walks alone along the sea wall. The evening air is thick and still, the water shifting lazily against the rocks. From here, the city looks calm, almost timeless. But he knows better. Calm is a surface, and beneath it, the currents are moving. The trick is to ensure they move in his favor. By late September, the heat has begun to loosen its grip, but the tensions running through Palermo feel no cooler. Riccobono senses it in the clipped greetings at the market, the faster turnover of customers at certain cafes, the absence of some familiar faces from their usual corners. It's the kind of shifting atmosphere that precedes change, either a consolidation of strength or the unraveling of control. One morning, he receives a discreet note delivered with his newspaper. The handwriting is careful, unsigned, but the meaning is clear. Someone intends to make a move on the western docks. No date is given, no name attached, but the timing is unmistakable. The docks are his anchor. Lose them, and the rest of his influence begins to drift. That afternoon, he drives to the port under the guise of inspecting a shipment of olive oil. The air smells of diesel and salt, the water churning softly against the hulls. Workers move in practiced rhythm, crates shifting from ship to truck, voices echoing in short, sharp bursts. Riccobono walks the length of the pier, stopping to speak with the foreman, then with the customs officer whose loyalty has been quietly cultivated for years. He asks about delays, about the arrival of a ship from Valencia, but what he's really looking for is any sign of unfamiliar hands in the operation. Historically, dock control in the 1980s Sicilian underworld was both a prize and a trap. Many people still think that once a territory was taken, it stayed secure. In reality, the docks were constantly tested, their value too great for rivals to ignore. In the evening, Riccobono summons a small circle of trusted men to his villa. They gather in the courtyard, the lemon trees casting long shadows in the fading light. over wine and bread, he outlines a plan. Every shipment, no matter how minor, will be double-checked. Every worker on the docks will have his loyalty quietly tested. If there is a breach, it will be found before it becomes a flood. When the meeting ends, Riccobono lingers alone in the courtyard. The air is cooling now, the first hint of autumn in the breeze. He looks toward the distant glimmer of the harbor lights. They seem steady tonight, but he knows that in the days ahead, they will need watching more closely than ever. November draws its shades early on the Palermo coast, and the light goes thin and silver over Mondello before most lamps are lit. He feels it in the air. The small animals go quiet a little sooner. The sea changes pitch against the rocks by the seawall, and a cool breath rides in from the darkening Tyrrhenian like an old omen returning to its seat. In the villa, the lemon trees barely stir. The house staff move softly, knowing that when the sky looks like this, the gentleman prefers fewer sounds, fewer questions, fewer lights. He dresses without hurry. Navy suit, winter weight, shoulders lying clean. The tailor's ledger has 3 entries this month for subtle alterations. Cuffs, waist, a hidden pocket he will pretend is for receipts. He slides the silver cigarette case into the inside breast, more talisman than habit now. He quit years ago, but the case is part of the uniform, a steady rectangle against the ribs. In the hall mirror, the tie falls in a small, exact V. He smooths it once and leaves the knot alone. The driver is waiting. The car with tinted glass purrs at the gate. Palermo has learned to darken early in 1982. Windows hold their light close. Scooters whisper instead of shout. He watches the city slide by and tracks how the streets are chosen. Good turns, unhurried merges, familiar sight lines. The driver has learned his preferences in the way that matters. He makes them feel like coincidence. Down by the port, cranes stand like long-necked birds sleeping. A crew hoses a deck where today's catch has left its bright scales. He studies the angle of the hose stream and the rhythm of the man's shoulders, and for a moment, the whole dock feels like memory assembled from muscle. An evening dinner. Ordinary on paper, the kind a man like him attends without thinking. There are reasons for such dinners. To show the pulse is steady, to keep a hand on what can still be counted, to hear in the echo of laughter whether a new edge has arrived. The invitation is phrased politely, the host respectable in the way respectable men are, and the call came through channels that have not failed him before. He tells himself this as the car leaves the water and climbs a modest rise through stone pines. As a villa's warm lamps appear with practiced welcome, historical truth runs under the road like old pipework. The early 1980s in Sicily are the years when the old balances break. The Second Mafia War moves like a weather system across the map. Men who ruled their neighborhoods by quiet arrangement are tested by a new arithmetic that favors total assurances over delicate peace. Lupara Bianca becomes a phrase in the papers. White shotgun, bodies vanished, funerals without bodies, women looking at closed caskets that hold only air and clothing. He has read the headlines he does not keep. He has heard the homilies he does not quote. He knows how a night can end when invited to prove you still belong. The gate opens. Gravel speaks under the tires. He steps out and smells damp earth and juniper, and a hint of burnt sugar from a kitchen that has plated desserts by habit for years. Men in good coats stand in the courtyard light. They come forward with smiles measured to the moment. Names pass. Hands meet. One of the younger faces works to keep his stare level. Ambition is a poor actor when it hurries. The older faces are smoother. They have practiced calm the way priests practice quiet. Inside, the table is long. Linen glows. A set of glasses waits for a wine that will make conversation gentle. He counts chairs without letting the eyes fix. He notes the distance between exits. He notes who sits with a wall at his back. He notes which waiter listens with his head slightly canted instead of bent. The host chooses a seat for him that would please a guest, near the view, near the wine, near the right ear. He accepts it and turns his body a degree more open than he feels. Courtesies are armor when knives stay sheathed. The meal arrives in the old order. Antipasti first, a line of sardines dressed in silver, a small plate of caponata that tastes of patient afternoons. Their laughter has weight. It wants to land as proof of normalcy. He contributes enough to allow the illusion to stand. A man to his left tells a story about a boat that forgot to cut a line and pulled half the pier when it left. He smiles. The host lifts a hand for wine and tells a different story about a truck that lost its brakes on a hill and somehow stopped on prayer alone. The table breathes. If a stranger walked in, he would think this is what civility looks like in winter, information closest to character. He lets the glass hover, and in that small pause, a private weather opens inside the chest. He feels the case against the ribs again, and thinks of the last photograph the papers ran, the one from the summer wedding, where he placed a hand on the father's shoulder, and the light made him look younger than memory allows. He thinks of Maria's voice when she said a stranger stood too long on her street. He thinks of Giulio's careful map, with the green pins leaning toward red. He thinks of the boy with the deflated ball in the alley years ago, waiting to see whether a man like him would stop and return it. A life is a string. He knows where it tightened and where it sang. Mainstream fact belongs in the room, whether anyone speaks it or not. Men in his position have begun to vanish this year. Some leave in cars that return clean as dinner plates. Some go walking, and the sea forgets to give them back. Trials in Palermo will later build lines around these absences, connecting dates to dinners, places to plateware. The official words will say a war settled accounts. The unofficial words, spoken on balconies, trading jokes with caution, will say something colder. The season changed, and the sea kept what it was given. The host proposes a toast. The words are flatter than they should be, too polished at the edges. He raises his glass and studies the reflection that moves along the rim, a curved window catching the chandelier's steady tremble. It looks like a pulse made of light. He turns it once, a man checking quality, and drinks less than half. The taste is fine. He does not taste the future in it. No man does. He sets the glass down and keeps his hand near it, because the hand needs something to do that isn't reaching for the past. They speak of roots, of winter seas, of the way dock work grows clumsy when the fingers go numb. Someone mentions tariffs in Rome, and someone else mentions a nephew who wants to be an architect instead of a sailor. He listens and allows them their small domestic light. He offers one of his own, a note about a fisherman in Sfericavallo who swears by a moonless net. Polite laughter. The host says the fisherman should give the assembly a lecture. He says Palermo has experts in everything except contentment. Eyes crease, the evening practices looking ordinary. Then the current changes in a way the untrained do not detect. A question looks more precise than conversation needs. A chair sound lasts one beat too long for comfort. A man across the table forgets to let his smile reach the eyes. He watches that smile stall and understands, with a clarity that shows as stillness, that the math of this dinner has been done elsewhere. He lowers his gaze for a heartbeat, as if to bless the bread. When he raises it, his face has the expression he wears when a storm arrives as forecast. Not surprise, not fear, not even resignation. A professional recognition. He could stand. He could let the chair legs talk to the floor and name the wrong arithmetic. He could refuse dessert and ask to see the garden where the night air is sweet. He could say he is grateful for the hospitality and must leave because his sister expects a call. He does none of these. The old codes remain inside him, even as the men who use them as props sharpen their other tools. If there is to be a last act, he will play it in the key that tuned the rest. He asks for water. He thanks the server. He compliments the pastry he has not yet tasted. He looks at the host and gives him the grace of a guest's final courtesy, the dignity of pretending we are what we have said we are. Later, no clock close enough to certify the minute, there is movement arranged to look like the conclusion of a long, respectful meal. Men rise. Coats find shoulders. A door opens and spills winter air across polished tile. He steps into that air and hears the gravel again. Remembers every courtyard in Palermo where gravel kept the tally of arrivals and departures. The sky is a hard black. The pines at the edge of the property sketch the old geometry against it. He buttons the coat. His thumb touches the cigarette case through the cloth and rests there, a small square of cold against the palm. History will say this month takes him. It will say November keeps its appointment. It will say that the gentleman of the Palermo coast, who liked his tables quiet and his routes steady, leaves the company of men without leaving a clean line for the record to hold. Some newspapers will run photographs of the sea. Some will run his old portrait and note the absence of a body, because this is a season that favors absences. In kitchens along the waterfront, women will lower their voices when they say his name. On the docks, men will tie knots more carefully for a while and watch the horizon as if it might confess, close to the man himself. He thinks not of titles, not of what the city calls him, but of small mornings. The first slice through a just-caught swordfish, the weight of a child's hand on his sleeve at a wedding, the lemon oil that lingers on the fingers after pruning a branch that grew in the wrong direction. He thinks of the old man who said patience is the sharpest blade, and wonders whether patience can cut fog. And he thinks, because memory is stubborn, of the boy's deflated ball rolling to him, and the feeling of returning it with a touch that says, "Not today. Not with me watching. Cars turn. Doors agree with hands." Somewhere, a dog barks once and stops, the way dogs do when the air changes shape. He lifts his chin enough to feel the breeze on the throat. He is a man of Palermo. He has walked into storms and walked out again. If this is what the weather brings, he will meet it with the grace he used to pour at weddings when the younger men watched to learn how not to spill. He squares the shoulders, which were a tailor's pride, and steps where the night asks him to step. The city receives the news without receiving the details. On the promenade, couples continue their evening walks. At the market, voices still call the weight of sardines and the price of oranges. At the Mondello beach, late-season waves push their broken lace against the sand. In the villa, the lemon trees wait, and the silver case does not return to its hook by the mirror. The garden meetings, the evening walks, the letters from abroad, the dock's after-dark rhythm, the art that moved from wall to wall so a ledger could breathe. All of it becomes a story a city tells itself when the lights are low and the sea argues with the stones. A gentleman can rule without raising his voice. A season can end without a door slamming. There will be men who pretend not to notice, and men who notice so much they grow quiet. There will be a younger face that sits in the mirror and practices a smile that does not reach the eyes. There will be a host who arranges another dinner and salts the fish as if salt is not a kind of snow. There will be a newspaper stand that sells out of the morning edition, and a barber who sweeps the same hair twice because he is thinking of something he has no words for. Palermo knows how to hold a secret without silence. It knows the grammar of whispers. If you were to stand on the seawall tonight, where he used to pause between espresso and the rest of the day, you would hear that grammar in the water. The tide says what the city cannot print. The foam on the rocks remembers every name for a week, and then lets it go so that living can continue. Lights in windows shrink and go out. A gull circles and changes its mind. Far offshore, a ship turns where the charts tell it to turn, following a route written by men who liked to make the earth feel predictable. It will reach the next port exactly when the schedule says it will, and the crates will be counted, and the ledgers will receive their ink. The world continues with its lists, even when a gentleman is deleted from them. When morning comes, someone will stop by the villa gate with a basket of oranges and an excuse. Someone will tell Maria what they refuse to say plainly. Someone will pick up a newspaper and fold it fast because the headline knows too much. Someone will open a cafe early and set aside the table by the mirror because habit is a kind of devotion. Palermo will fill with traffic, and a school bell will ring in Calça, and the port will swing its cranes like arms stretching. The coast will wear its fragile calm again, elegant from a distance, cracking if you lean too close. And men who watched him walk will walk a little differently, tucking a courtesy back into their pockets like a spare key. Let the picture ease itself to the smallest possible frame. Gray water turning silver under a thin November sun. A ribbon of road following the sea's slow grammar. A villa whose shutters are angled to keep the morning soft. Let the voices of the market recede to a hush. The tire noise thin to a ribbon. The smell of lemon and salt becomes something as light as a memory resting in the air. Breathe with the city as it does what old cities do. Exhale a long night and take up its small rituals with quiet hands. Think of him not at the table where the evening tilted, but on the seawall where the breeze lifts a loosened hair and the world seems briefly arranged. Think of the simple weights he trusted, the heft of a good suit on the shoulders, the reliable click of a case opening, the small decision to return a boy's ball as if to say that for one moment, nothing breaks. Let the docks go still. The cranes hold their pose. The last boats find their berths with the patience of creatures that understand tide more than time. Now slow everything again. Breath, heart, horizon, until the line between sea and sky is only suggestion, until footsteps become smudges, until the lemon leaves are more color than shape. If the city whispers, let it. If the past leans close, let it lean, and then step back. Take the night down to one sound, the soft wash of water against rock. Take it further, to just the after sound, and then to the quiet that remembers even that. When you're ready, let the lights inside your own room dim a little more. Let the tide finish the sentence the day began. Palermo keeps its watch. The coast holds you as if the air itself were a careful hand. Sleep now.